Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Jill Dando? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoy this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Jill Wendy Dando was born in Weston-super-Mare, Somerset, England, on November 9, 1961. Her father's name was Jack. He worked for a newspaper. Her mother's name was Winifred. Jill had one sibling, an older brother, who also worked for the newspaper where her father worked. Jill was described as highly driven and outgoing. She studied journalism at Cardiff Metropolitan University. After graduating, she became a reporter for the newspaper where her father and brother worked. About 5 years later, she took a job with the BBC and read the news on the radio. She transferred to another division in 1985 and presented news for a regional news program. After moving to a couple of different jobs, she was transferred to presenting the news on national television in London in 1988. She worked on various BBC television programs over the next several years, including the 6 o'clock news and a true crime show called Crime Watch. Jill Dando was extremely successful and was one of the most well-known and well-liked BBC television personalities. She traveled all throughout the world and stayed in nice hotels. She visited exotic locations. Despite being wealthy and having a luxurious lifestyle, Jill was thought of as a humble and down-to-earth individual, a person who made genuine connections with people. Jill dated a few different men throughout her life. She met a physician in December of 1997. They became engaged in 1999 and planned their wedding for September of that same year. It was a wedding that would never occur. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On April 26, 1999, Jill left her fiancé's home in Chiswick and drove to a house that she owned in Fulham. Both of these neighborhoods are in West London. She rarely visited her house. She was in the process of selling it because she was engaged and living with her fiancé. Jill walked up to her front door at about 11:32 a.m. Before she was able to enter the house, she was attacked by an unknown assailant. She was grabbed from behind and pushed to the ground. The assailant pushed a semi-automatic pistol chambered in .380 ACP against Jill's head right above her ear and fired one time. At 11:46 a.m., Jill's body was discovered by a neighbor. The police were called 1 minute later. Jill Dando was transported to a hospital and pronounced dead at 1:03 p.m. She was 37 years old. The investigation was conducted by the Metropolitan Police in London. It was the most extensive since the police were looking for the Yorkshire Ripper, who was eventually identified as Peter Sutcliffe. I have a separate video about him. Here's what the police found during their investigation of Jill Dando's murder. Whoever murdered Jill did not steal anything from her. 2 witnesses spotted a man in a dark jacket running from the scene. He was described as a 6-foot-tall, 40-year-old white male with thick black hair. One of those witnesses was Jill's next-door neighbor. He heard a scream, but did not hear a gunshot. About an hour and a half before the murder, a postal delivery worker was delivering mail to Jill's house when he noticed a man was watching him. The man had dark hair and was wearing a suit. A blue Range Rover was spotted parked illegally not far from Jill's house, and a blue Range Rover was seen speeding away not long after 11:30 a.m. The spent case from the round that killed Jill was found on her doorstep next to her body. Based on the wound that Jill sustained to her head, it was clear that the killer did not use a silencer. Rather, he pressed the barrel up against her skin. As I mentioned, the cartridge used in this murder was a .380 ACP, which is also known as a 9mm short. It is the same diameter as a 9mm parabellum, but it is about 40% less powerful. Typically, the .380 is used in smaller pistols carried for self-defense. The spent case that was found at the scene of the murder appeared as though it had been modified. There was an unusual indentation on it. The police believe that the shooter had removed the bullet from the case and extracted some of the propellant, which would reduce the loudness of the gunshot and make the cartridge more compatible with a replica gun which was modified to be functional. So it may have been that the killer did not use or have access to an actual pistol and instead modified a weapon that was not supposed to be functional. Jill had interacted with thousands of people personally, and millions of people had seen her on television. The police talked to over 2,500 people and documented over 1,000 statements during their investigation. Eventually, the police started to focus their attention on a man named Barry George. He lived about a half-mile away from Jill's house. Barry had a criminal history which made him appear to be a good suspect. According to the police, he had been in trouble for posing as a police officer, offenses of a sexual nature, and stalking. The police obtained a search warrant for his house. They found maps containing the locations of women, an empty holster for a firearm. A photograph was found of Barry holding a pistol, which was consistent with the one that the police believed was used in the murder. And they seized a dark, three-quarter length coat. Inside the pocket of this coat, the police found a single particle of gunshot residue. It matched the gunshot residue found on Jill's hair and on the spent case. When Barry was interviewed about his whereabouts, he changed his story. Witnesses placed Barry near Jill's house about 4 hours before the murder. Barry George was arrested on May 25, 2000, and charged with murder 3 days later. His trial took place in the summer of 2001. He was convicted on July 2 and sentenced to life in prison. He unsuccessfully appealed twice. His third appeal, however, was successful. His conviction was overturned. He was tried for a second time, but this time the gunshot residue particle was excluded as evidence. On August 1, 2008, he was found not guilty. At the time making this video, the murder of Jill Dando remains unsolved, although many people believe that Barry George was guilty in reality. There is not much hope that this case will be solved in the future. Now moving to my analysis. Let's take a look at the theories about what happened in this case. Theory number one is that Barry George was guilty despite his acquittal. Just because someone is found not guilty in a court of law doesn't mean they are necessarily innocent of the offense. Barry lived nearby. He had a history of criminality involving women, was spotted in the area 4 hours before the murder, attempted to fabricate an alibi, and had a single particle of gunshot residue in the inside pocket of his coat. The problem with this theory is that the particle could have been transferred in a number of ways. It did not necessarily get in his coat pocket by him placing a pistol in there. In addition, even if he did put a handgun in his pocket, that doesn't mean that he used that handgun to kill anybody. Theory number two, Jill was murdered in an effort to retaliate against media outlets for the actions of NATO. Looking at the evidence supporting this theory, the BBC and other media outlets received telephone calls in which groups in Serbia claimed responsibility for Jill's murder. One of these calls came into the BBC just 2 hours after Jill's murder was made public. A journalist was murdered in Serbia 15 days before Jill was murdered. The method of the homicide was the same. In 2019, 4 members of the Serbian Secret Service were convicted of that homicide. As far as evidence refuting this theory, the police do not consider the claim of responsibility to be credible. It seems unusual that somebody would kill Jill Dando to advance a cause related to the war in Serbia. It seems like a tenuous connection. Professional killers typically do not kill in broad daylight, shoot just one time, and leave a spent case behind, especially one that may have been modified. Most professional killers can afford more than one cartridge. It seems reasonable to believe that professional hitmen would try to cut costs in certain areas of their business, but ammunition would not be one area. Theory number 3 is that Jill Dando offended a criminal on the Crime Watch TV show, and that individual wanted revenge. One would think that many of the people she was talking about would either be in prison or not be identified. If they were in prison, they could not have made the trip to Jill's house. I know that some of the prisons have these deals where they let the prisoners out on like a day pass, but I'm sure there's some type of form they have to fill out before they're released. If they check off the murder box as the reason they want to get out, I'm sure the guards would be suspicious. If the criminals were not identified, why would they take a chance of committing murder in broad daylight? I suppose someone working for an offended criminal could have carried out the murder for that criminal. It's unlikely, but technically possible. Theory number 4, Jill was murdered randomly for no reason. This theory explains why the video surveillance cameras at a store she visited prior to arriving at her residence did not capture anyone following her. there was no evidence found on any camera in that area that Jill was being followed. The problem with this theory is that the postal worker saw a suspicious figure watching him as he delivered mail to Jill's house. This makes it seem like Jill was specifically targeted, unless somebody had an unhealthy obsession with the postal service. Theory number 5, a professional hitman was hired to kill a BBC reporter named Lisa Brinkworth and killed Jill Dando by mistake. Lisa's residence was in the same neighborhood as Jill's house, and Lisa's physician was Jill's fiancé. The problem with this theory is that it assumes a discount or incompetent hitman was hired. Killing the right person is the key objective in the murder-for-hire business. Wouldn't the hitman have been curious as to why the woman he killed was trying to get into Jill's residence? Theory number 6, Jill was killed by a former romantic partner. Jill did not have an excessive quantity of former romantic partners, and the police confirmed that all of them were murder-free. Which brings me to theory number 7. Jill was killed by a stalker, who was almost certainly male. The man wanted to be her romantic partner, but could not achieve this goal because she rejected him. This theory fits with a number of circumstances involved in this crime. The killer was a man who was about 40 years old. He did not steal anything. He did not commit any type of offense related to sex. He simply walked up to her, pushed her to the ground, and shot her. His only objective was the homicide. Jill's engagement had recently been announced, which meant that she was romantically unavailable. A stalker may have interpreted this as a rejection. The police identified 140 people who were obsessed with Jill, including a few that sent her fan mail, which could be characterized as having a clothing deficit. Jill's brother told the police that some guy was bothering Jill a few days before she was murdered. Another version of the story would be that the stalker never actually met Jill. Perhaps the killer suffered from something like an erotomanic delusion. He believed that Jill was in love with him, or should have been in love with him. At some point, he became angry when he could not fulfill his desires. In May of 2016, a singer named Christina Grimmie was murdered after a concert in Florida by a young man who was obsessed with her. Her first contact with the killer was when he shot her. He had never made contact with her or attempted to make contact with her in the past. If this happened to Jill Dando, it explains why the police were unable to find any evidence of a stalker. How would I rank these theories from most to least likely? I would say that the most likely theory would be number 7, a stalker was the killer. Then I would go with theory number 1, Barry George. One could argue this theory is a version of the stalker theory. Then I would move to theory number 3. It was a criminal she talked about on Crime Watch. Theory number 5, mistaken identity. Theory number 2, an agent from Serbia. Theory number 6, a former lover. And finally, theory number 4, a random person. I think that all of the theories, except for the stalker theory and the Barry George theory, are extremely unlikely. In my opinion, the killer was almost certainly either a stalker or Barry George specifically. Now moving to my final thoughts. Conspiracy theories are often attractive when there is a mystery. Sometimes these theories are true, but usually they are not. In the case of Jill Dando, many people were attracted to outlandish and improbable theories, like these secret agents from other countries and these incompetent hitmen. In reality, it was almost certainly a stalker who brought an end to her life. Those are my thoughts in the case of Jill Dando. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis to be as intriguing as countries that maintain discount secret agent services. Thanks for watching.